Chapter 1. The Man Who Wasn't There. The fog that evening was unlike any I had seen before. It did not merely obscure the streets of London. It seemed to consume them, swallowing the gaslights and muffling the sounds of the city until all that remained was an oppressive silence. I sat by a fire in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, a glass of brandy in hand, while Sherlock Holmes lounged in his armchair, his eyes half closed, his mind undoubtedly racing through some labyrinthine puzzle. The knock at the door came as a shock, not least because it seemed to echo from a great distance, though the door itself was but a few paces away. Holmes' eyes snapped open, and he rose with the fluid grace of a cat sensing danger. "Watson," he said, his voice low and measured, "observe." I followed him to the door, my hand instinctively brushing the revolver in my pocket. Holmes opened it to reveal a man, or rather, the shadow of a man. He was tall, his face obscured by the brim of a hat pulled low, his coat hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to waver, as though he were not entirely solid. "Mr. Holmes," the man said, his voice hollow, almost echoing, "I require your assistance." Holmes stepped aside, allowing the man to enter. As he passed, I caught a whiff of something metallic, like old blood, and something else, something I could not place, but which made my skin crawl. The man sat in the chair by the fire, his hands trembling as he removed his gloves. His fingers were long and pale, almost skeletal. I was a historian," he began, his voice faltering. "My name was Henry Acton, or perhaps it still is. I cannot be certain." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "Explain." Acton's eyes darted around the room, as though searching for something or someone. 3 days ago, I was researching the history of an abbey in the countryside, St. Cuthbert's Abbey. It was abandoned in the 16th century, but I found references to it in a manuscript that suggested it was still in use secretly. I went to investigate. He paused, his breath quickening. When I arrived, the abbey was there. I saw it. I touched its stones. But when I returned to London, no one remembered it. Not the locals, not my colleagues. Even the manuscript I had found was gone. And then I began to forget things. My own notes, my research, my name. Holmes' eyes narrowed. "And now," Acton's voice dropped to a whisper, "now I am not sure I exist at all." There was a moment of silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Holmes rose and began to pace, his mind clearly racing. "Watson," he said abruptly, "fetch me the morning papers from the past week, and the directory of London residents." I did as he asked, though I could not see the connection. Holmes flipped through the papers with rapid precision, his eyes scanning the pages. Then he stopped, his finger resting on a name. "Henry Acton," he read aloud, "listed here as a historian, with an address in Bloomsbury." But he turned to the directory, flipping through its pages. Gone, as though he never was. Acton let out a shuddering breath. "You see, I am being erased." Holmes' eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. "Not erased, Mr. Acton. Hidden, and I intend to uncover why." Chapter 2. The Abbey That Wasn't There. The next morning found us on a train bound for the countryside, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels doing little to ease the tension that had settled over us. Henry Acton sat across from us, his face pale and drawn, his hands clutching a valise filled with the few remnants of his research that had not yet vanished. His eyes darted nervously to the window, as though expecting the landscape itself to shift before his very eyes. Holmes spent the journey in silence, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, though I knew his mind was far from the rolling hills and grazing sheep. Occasionally he would scribble a note in his pocketbook, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Watson," he said suddenly, as the train slowed, "what do you make of our client?" I hesitated. "He seems unwell." but his story is too detailed to be mere delusion. Holmes nodded. Precisely. And yet there is something missing, a thread we have not yet grasped. The train came to a halt at a small station, its platform deserted save for a lone porter who eyed us with mild curiosity. We disembarked, and Acton led us down a winding path that cut through fields of tall grass. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, and the distant call of a crow echoed ominously. "The Abbey should be just beyond that hill," Acton said, his voice trembling. But when we crested the rise, there was nothing. Only an empty expanse of land, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional tree. Acton let out a strangled cry. It was here, I swear it. Holmes knelt, running his fingers over the ground. "Watson, look at this." I joined him and saw what he had noticed, faint depressions in the earth, too regular to be natural. The outline of a foundation, long since buried. "The Abbey was here," Holmes said, his voice calm, but with an edge of excitement. "But it has been removed. Not destroyed, removed." Acton sank to his knees, his face a mask of despair. What kind of power could do such a thing? Holmes' eyes gleamed. The kind that does not wish to be found. We spent the next hour combing the area, Holmes meticulously examining every inch of the ground, while I documented our findings in my notebook. Acton trailed behind us, his earlier agitation giving way to a hollow resignation. "Holmes," I said at last, "if the Abbey was here, why would someone go to such lengths to erase it?" Holmes straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "That, Watson, is the question. But consider this. If one can erase a building, what else can one erase? A person, a memory, an entire history." His words sent a chill through me, though I could not entirely dismiss the possibility that Acton's distress had clouded his judgment. Yet the evidence before us was undeniable. The Abbey had existed, and now it did not. As we prepared to leave, Acton suddenly froze, his eyes widening in horror. "Do you hear that?" I listened, but heard nothing save the rustle of the wind through the grass. "What is it?" Holmes asked sharply. Acton's voice was barely a whisper. "Bells. I hear bells." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. There were no bells, no churches nearby, nothing to explain the sound. Yet Acton's terror was palpable. "We must return to London," Holmes said decisively. "There is more to this mystery than meets the eye, and I suspect the answers lie not here, but in the heart of the city." As we made our way back to the station, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. The countryside, so peaceful moments before, now seemed alive with unseen eyes, and as the train pulled away, I glanced back at the empty field where the Abbey should have been, half expecting it to reappear, or for it to vanish from my memory entirely. Chapter 3. The Society of the Forgotten. The return journey to London was a sombre affair. Henry Acton sat hunched in the corner of the train carriage, his face pale and drawn, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the window. Holmes, meanwhile, was a whirlwind of activity, scribbling notes in his pocketbook, and muttering to himself in that way he did when a case had fully captured his attention. "Watson," he said abruptly, breaking the silence, "what do you know of the Ordo Memoriae?" I frowned. "The Order of Memory. I can't say I've heard of it." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Precisely. And yet I suspect it is at the heart of this mystery." He produced a small, leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket and handed it to me. Inside were sketches of symbols, strange, intricate designs that seemed to blend ancient runes with alchemical signs. These were etched into the stones of the Abbey's foundation, Holmes explained. "I copied them before we left. They match references I have encountered in my studies of obscure societies. The Ordo Memoriae is said to be a secretive group dedicated to the control of knowledge, specifically the erasure of inconvenient truths. Acton stirred at this, his voice trembling. "Then it is true. They are real." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "Tell me everything you know about them." Acton hesitated, as though afraid to speak the name aloud. "They are a myth or so, I thought. A society of scholars, historians, and philosophers who believe that history is not a record of the past, but a tool to shape the future. They erase what they deem dangerous, rewriting history to suit their purposes." "And the Abbey?" I asked. "Street Cuthbert's Abbey was one of their strongholds," Acton replied. "I found references to it in a manuscript that no longer exists. The Abbey was a repository of forbidden knowledge, a place where they stored the records of what they had erased." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "And you stumbled upon it?" Acton nodded, his face a mask of despair. "I was too curious. I went to the Abbey, and now they are erasing me." The train rattled on, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels underscoring the gravity of Acton's words. I found myself glancing at my own notebook, half expecting the words I had written to fade before my eyes. Upon our return to Baker Street, Holmes immediately set to work, spreading out his notes and sketches on the sitting-room table. He moved with a feverish intensity, his mind clearly racing to piece together the puzzle. "Watson," he said, "fetch me my Index of Secret Societies and the volume on medieval symbology." I did as he asked, though I could not shake the feeling that we were treading on dangerous ground. As I handed him the books, I noticed a faint tremor in his hands, a rare sign of excitement or perhaps unease. "Here," Holmes said at last, pointing to a symbol in one of the books. "This matches the markings from the Abbey. It is the sigil of the Ordo Memoria, a circle within a triangle representing the threefold nature of memory, creation, preservation, and erasure." "But why erase the Abbey?" I asked. "What could it have contained that was so dangerous?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "That, Watson, is the question. But consider this. If the Ordo Memoria has the power to erase a building, what else can they erase? A person, a memory, an entire history." His words sent a chill through me, though I could not entirely dismiss the possibility that we were chasing shadows. Yet the evidence before us was undeniable. The Abbey had existed, and now it did not. As the evening wore on, Acton grew increasingly agitated, pacing the room and muttering to himself. Finally he turned to Holmes, his eyes wild with fear. "They are coming for me," he said. "I can feel it. They will erase me, just as they erased the Abbey." Holmes rose, his expression calm but resolute. "Then we must act quickly. Watson, prepare yourself. We have a meeting to arrange." "A meeting?" I asked. Holmes' lips curved into a faint smile. "With the Ordo Memoria." Chapter 4. The Vanishing Witness. The following morning found us in the heart of London, making our way to the home of a farmer named Thomas Greaves. According to Acton, Greaves had lived near Street Cuthbert's Abbey for decades and had spoken of it in passing during Acton's initial visit. If anyone could corroborate the Abbey's existence, it would be him. The streets were bustling with the usual chaos of the city, but the oppressive fog of the previous night had lifted, leaving the air crisp and clear. Yet, despite the sunlight, a sense of unease lingered, a feeling that we were being watched. "Holmes," I said as we approached Greaves' modest home, "do you truly believe this farmer will remember the Abbey?" Holmes' expression was inscrutable. "If he does not, Watson, it will be as telling as if he does." We knocked on the door, and after a moment, it was opened by a woman with a worn face and tired eyes. "Mrs. Greaves?" Holmes inquired. She nodded, her gaze flickering nervously between us. "Yes. What do you want?" "We are here to speak with your husband," Holmes said smoothly. "We understand he may have information about Street Cuthbert's Abbey." Her face paled, and she shook her head. "I'm sorry, but you must be mistaken. My husband. He's never mentioned any abbey. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Is he at home? She hesitated, then stepped aside to let us in. He's in the sitting room. But I warn you, he's not been himself lately. We found Thomas Greaves seated by the fire, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was a stout man, his face weathered by years of labour, but his eyes were distant, as though he were staring at something far beyond the walls of the room. "Mr. Greaves," Holmes said, his voice calm but firm, "we need to speak with you about Street Cuthbert's Abbey." Greaves flinched, his hands tightening into fists. I don't know what you're talking about." Holmes stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "You lived near the Abbey for decades. Surely you remember it." Greaves shook his head, his voice trembling. "No, there was no Abbey. There's never been an Abbey." I exchanged a glance with Holmes. The man's denial was too vehement, too desperate. "Mr. Greaves," I said gently, "if you know something, you must tell us. It could be a matter of great importance." For a moment, Greaves seemed to waver, his eyes flickering with something like recognition. Then he stood abruptly, his face contorted with fear. "You need to leave," he said, his voice rising. "Now." Before we could respond, he turned and fled the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. We heard the slam of a door, followed by silence. Mrs. Greaves appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "I'm sorry," she said. "He's been like this for days. He keeps saying he's forgetting things, important things." Holmes' expression was grim. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Greaves. We will trouble you no further." As we left the house, I could not shake the feeling that we had missed something crucial. "Holmes," I said, "what do you make of that?" Holmes' eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. He remembers Watson, but he is afraid to speak, and I suspect his fear is well-founded. We returned to Baker Street, where Acton was waiting anxiously. Holmes immediately set to work, cross-referencing his notes with the information we had gathered. "Watson," he said at last, "fetch me the directory of London residents." I did as he asked, though I could not see the connection. Holmes flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he stopped, his finger resting on a name. "Thomas Greaves," he read aloud, "listed here as a farmer, with an address in the countryside." But he turned to the directory, flipping through its pages. Gone, as though he never was. Acton let out a shuddering breath. "You see, they are erasing him, just as they erased me." Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Then we must act quickly. Watson, prepare yourself. We have a meeting to arrange." "A meeting?" I asked. Holmes' lips curved into a faint smile. "With the Order of Memoria. Chapter 5. The House That Cannot Be Seen." The address Holmes had uncovered was in a quiet, unremarkable corner of London. A street lined with row houses, their facades nearly identical. Yet, as we approached, I felt a strange unease, as though the very air around us had grown heavier. "Number 23, Holmes murmured, his eyes scanning the buildings, or rather where number 23 should be. I followed his gaze and saw it, a gap between numbers 22 and 24, a space that seemed to blur when looked at directly. It was as though the house were there and yet not there, a trick of the light or perhaps of the mind. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice low, "do you see it?" I blinked, trying to focus. I'm not sure. It's as though my eyes refused to settle on it. Holmes' lips curved into a faint smile. "Precisely. The house is hidden, but not invisible. It exists in the periphery, just beyond the reach of conscious perception." Acton, who had accompanied us, let out a strangled cry. "This is it. This is where they operate." Holmes stepped forward, his movements deliberate. "Stay close, Watson, and keep your wits about you." As we approached the gap between the houses, the air seemed to ripple, like heat rising from pavement. Then, with a sudden clarity, the house came into view, a tall, narrow building with a weathered facade and windows that seemed to stare like empty eyes. The door was ajar, and Holmes pushed it open with a cautious hand. The interior was dim, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with books, scrolls, and strange artifacts that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural light. "This is a repository," Holmes said, his voice tinged with awe. "A place where they store the records of what they have erased." Acton stepped forward, his eyes wide with fear and fascination. "And the machine, it must be here." "Machine?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "A device capable of altering memories and records, the key to their power." We moved deeper into the house, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The air grew colder, and I felt a strange pressure in my head, as though the very walls were pressing in on me. Then we found it, a massive clockwork mechanism, its gears turning with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The machine was unlike anything I had ever seen, its design both ancient and impossibly advanced. "This is it," Acton whispered. "The heart of the Ordo Memoriae." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with that familiar intensity. "Watson, document everything. We must understand how it works." As I began to sketch the machine in my notebook, I noticed something strange. The ink seemed to fade as soon as it touched the paper, the lines disappearing before my eyes. "Holmes," I said, my voice trembling, "my notes, they're vanishing." Holmes turned, his expression grim. "Then we must act quickly. Acton, help me." Together, they began to examine the machine, their movements swift and precise. But as they worked, the air around us seemed to grow heavier, the pressure in my head intensifying. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. Chapter 6. The first erasure. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on us from all sides. I fumbled for my revolver, my heart pounding in my chest, but Holmes' voice cut through the blackness like a blade. "Stay calm, Watson. Do not move." I froze, straining to hear over the sound of my own breathing. Then slowly, a faint light began to emanate from the machine, its gears turning with a low rhythmic hum. The light grew brighter, illuminating the room in an eerie, pulsating glow. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and cloaked in black, their face obscured by a hood. "You should not have come here," the figure said, their voice cold and hollow. Holmes stepped forward, his gaze steady. "We are here to put an end to your manipulations. The Ordo Memoriae will be exposed." The figure laughed, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You think you can stop us? You are but a flicker in the grand tapestry of history, Mr. Holmes. And like all flickers, you will be extinguished." Acton, who had been silent until now, suddenly cried out, "You took everything from me. My work, my name, my very existence." The figure turned to him, their voice dripping with contempt. "You were a fool to meddle in matters beyond your understanding, and now you will be forgotten as though you never were." Before any of us could react, the figure raised a hand, and the machine's hum grew louder, the light intensifying until it was almost blinding. I felt a strange pressure in my head, a sensation of something being pulled, like a thread unraveling from a tapestry. Then, with a sudden deafening crack, the light vanished, and the room was plunged into darkness once more. When the light returned, the figure was gone, but so was Acton. "Holmes," I said, my voice trembling, "where is he?" Holmes' expression was grim. "Gone, Watson. Erased." I stared at the spot where Acton had stood, my mind reeling. But how? Holmes stepped closer to the machine, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of fascination and dread. "This device is more powerful than I imagined. It does not merely alter records, it alters reality itself." I felt a chill run through me. Then we are in grave danger. Holmes nodded. Indeed, but we are not without recourse. The machine is their greatest weapon, but it is also their greatest vulnerability. If we can destroy it, we can disrupt their operations. As he spoke, I noticed something strange. The notes I had taken earlier were fading, the ink disappearing from the pages as though it had never been there. "Holmes," I said, holding up the notebook, "my notes. They're vanishing." Holmes' expression darkened. "Then we must act quickly. Watson, help me." Together we began to examine the machine, searching for a way to disable it. But as we worked, the air around us seemed to grow heavier, the pressure in my head intensifying. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness once more. Chapter 7. The Clockwork Mechanism. The darkness was suffocating, but Holmes' voice cut through it like a beacon. "Watson, stay close. We must not lose our bearings." I reached out blindly, my hand brushing against the cold metal of the machine. The air was thick with the scent of oil and ozone, and the low hum of the gears seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "Holmes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what is this thing?" Holmes' reply was calm but urgent. "A device of unparalleled ingenuity and danger. It is not merely a machine, Watson. It is a tool for rewriting reality itself." As he spoke, a faint light began to emanate from the machine once more, illuminating the room in a ghostly glow. I could now see the intricate network of gears, levers, and dials that made up the mechanism, each component moving in perfect harmony. Holmes stepped closer, his eyes scanning the machine with a mixture of awe and determination. "This is no ordinary clockwork. It is a fusion of ancient alchemy and modern engineering, designed to manipulate the very fabric of memory and history." I felt a chill run through me. "But how does it work?" Holmes pointed to a series of symbols etched into the machine's surface, the same symbols we had seen at the Abbey. "These are not mere decorations. They are instructions, a code that dictates the machine's function. By altering the symbols, one can alter what is remembered and what is forgotten." As he spoke, I noticed something strange. The symbols seemed to shift and change, as though they were alive. "Holmes," I said, my voice trembling, "the symbols. They're moving." Holmes' expression was grim. "The machine is active. It is rewriting something, or someone, even as we speak." Before I could respond, the machine's hum grew louder, the light intensifying until it was almost blinding. I felt a strange pressure in my head, a sensation of something being pulled, like a thread unraveling from a tapestry. Then, with a sudden deafening crack, the light vanished, and the room was plunged into darkness once more. When the light returned, I saw that one of the symbols on the machine had changed, its shape now unfamiliar and unsettling. "Holmes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what just happened?" Holmes' expression was grim. "The machine has erased something or someone, and if we do not act quickly, it will erase us as well." Together, we began to examine the machine, searching for a way to disable it. But as we worked, the air around us seemed to grow heavier, the pressure in my head intensifying. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness once more. Chapter 8. The trap is set. The darkness was absolute, but Holmes' voice cut through it with calm authority. "Watson, follow my lead. We must not lose our bearings." I reached out blindly, my hand brushing against the cold metal of the machine. The air was thick with the scent of oil and ozone, and the low hum of the gears seemed to vibrate through my very bones. "Holmes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what is our plan?" Holmes' reply was calm but urgent. "We must disable the machine, but to do so, we must first understand its workings. And to understand its workings, We must outwit its creators." As he spoke, a faint light began to emanate from the machine once more, illuminating the room in a ghostly glow. I could now see the intricate network of gears, levers, and dials that made up the mechanism, each component moving in perfect harmony. Holmes stepped closer, his eyes scanning the machine with a mixture of awe and determination. "This is no ordinary clockwork. It is a fusion of ancient alchemy and modern engineering, designed to manipulate the very fabric of memory and history." I felt a chill run through me. But how do we stop it? Holmes pointed to a series of symbols etched into the machine's surface, the same symbols we had seen at the Abbey. "These are not mere decorations. They are instructions, a code that dictates the machine's function. By altering the symbols, one can alter what is remembered and what is forgotten." As he spoke, I noticed something strange. The symbols seemed to shift and change, as though they were alive. "Holmes," I said, my voice trembling, "the symbols, they're moving." Holmes' expression was grim. "The machine is active. It is rewriting something, or someone, even as we speak." Before I could respond, the machine's hum grew louder, the light intensifying until it was almost blinding. I felt a strange pressure in my head, a sensation of something being pulled, like a thread unraveling from a tapestry. Then, with a sudden deafening crack, the light vanished, and the room was plunged into darkness once more. When the light returned, I saw that one of the symbols on the machine had changed, its shape now unfamiliar and unsettling. "Holmes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what just happened?" Holmes' expression was grim. "The machine has erased something, or someone, and if we do not act quickly, it will erase us as well." Together, we began to examine the machine, searching for a way to disable it. But as we worked, the air around us seemed to grow heavier, the pressure in my head intensifying. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness once more. Chapter 9. The Final Confrontation. The darkness was suffocating, but Holmes' voice cut through it like a blade. "Watson, stay close. The moment is upon us." I followed his voice, my hand brushing against the cold metal of the machine. The air was thick with tension, the hum of the gears growing louder with each passing second. Then, with a sudden burst of light, the room was illuminated once more. Standing before us was the hooded figure we had encountered earlier, their presence commanding and ominous. "You are persistent, Mr. Holmes," the figure said, their voice cold and hollow. "But persistence will not save you." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze steady. "We are here to put an end to your manipulations. The Ordo Memoria will be exposed." The figure laughed, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You think you can stop us? You are but a flicker in the grand tapestry of history, Mr. Holmes, and like all flickers, you will be extinguished." Holmes' eyes gleamed with that familiar intensity. "Perhaps, but even a flicker can start a fire." With a swift motion, Holmes reached for the machine, his fingers deftly manipulating the symbols etched into its surface. The machine's hum grew louder, the light intensifying until it was almost blinding. The figure stepped forward, their voice rising in anger. "Stop. You do not understand what you are doing." Holmes' expression was grim. "On the contrary, I understand perfectly. This machine is a tool for rewriting reality, but it is also a weapon, and like all weapons, it can be turned against its wielder." As he spoke, the machine's gears began to grind, the light pulsing with a rhythmic intensity. I felt a strange pressure in my head, a sensation of something being pulled, like a thread unraveling from a tapestry. Then, with a sudden deafening crack, the light vanished, and the room was plunged into darkness once more. When the light returned, the figure was gone. But so was the machine. "Holmes," I said, my voice trembling, "what just happened?" Holmes' expression was grim. The machine has been destroyed, but at a cost. I felt a chill run through me. What cost? Holmes turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. The Ordo Memoria has been erased, Watson, but so have the memories of their actions. The world will never know what they did, or what we did to stop them. Chapter 10. The Forgotten Victory. The days that followed were a blur. Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, the weight of our victory, if it could be called that, hanging heavily over us. The machine was gone, the Ordo Memoria erased, and yet the world seemed unchanged. I sat by the fire, my notebook open on my lap, but the pages were blank. The notes I had taken during the investigation had vanished, as though they had never existed. "Holmes," I said, my voice tinged with frustration, "I cannot recall the details of the case. It's as though it never happened." Holmes sat across from me, his expression inscrutable. "Some truths, Watson, are not meant to be remembered." I frowned. "But how can we be sure we succeeded? If we cannot remember, how do we know the Ordo Memoria is truly gone?" Holmes' lips curved into a faint smile. "Because, my dear Watson, we are still here, and the world, for all its flaws, remains as it should be." His words offered little comfort, but I knew he was right. The Ordo Memoria had sought to control history, to erase what they deemed inconvenient, and yet their greatest weapon had been turned against them, their own machinations leading to their downfall. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself haunted by fragments of memories, a crumbling abbey, a hidden house, a machine that hummed with unnatural life. But these fragments were fleeting, slipping through my fingers like smoke. One evening, as we sat in our familiar chairs, Holmes broke the silence. "Watson," he said, his voice unusually soft, "do you remember Henry Acton?" I frowned, searching my memory. The name is familiar, but I cannot place it. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "Some cases, Watson, are not meant to be remembered."